Hi, this is Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington, and today I wanted to talk about this Parker Fly and some pretty Parker-specific issues that it's having. So let's go ahead and talk about Parker guitars for just a second. Parker guitars are, they're a guitar, first of all, they're no longer made, but while they were made, these were pretty innovative guitars. These were guitars that implemented a lot of very different things. So as opposed to like opening up a guitar and you know, seeing that it's kind of like Strat-like or Les Paul-like, these are pretty unique to themselves. There's a lot of differences in the way that these guitars work, such as different ways of implementing a tremolo, different ways of doing the wiring, and lots of different materials that are used, alternative materials like carbon fiber and other composites and things like that. This guitar here happens to have a carbon fiber back and a carbon fiber fretboard, which is pretty neat. But, you know, with all of the unique stuff going on these guitars, it's kind of, you know, par for the course that it's going to have some pretty unique issues. This issue isn't necessarily unique to Parker, but it is unique in terms of how we had to go about fixing it in this guitar because of kind of some ways that this guitar is built. So let's go ahead and talk about the problem that this is having. This is a fairly common problem for Parker guitars, and so I just want to kind of put this video out there for you guys who might be experiencing the same thing. Anyway, so what happened was that this pot ended up becoming loose. That is to say that this bolt that secures the pot to the guitar ended up coming loose, and the pot itself was kind of allowed to spin around in the electronics cavity. And so, you know, a potentiometer on the inside of the guitar kind of looks like this, and so if it's spinning around, it means that rather than just turning this guy up here, you're turning the whole thing. This can create problems in that, you know, in all guitars, you know, there are electronic connections. There are connections going to these components, going from one component to another. And in most guitars where there's point-to-point wiring, you're kind of putting a lot of strain on these solder joints as you kind of twist this around. There's going to be some wires hooked up here, and that solder joint is going to be the thing taking the brunt of that force as you're kind of trying to move this thing around. And those oftentimes will break when that happens because they're just not meant to take that kind of abuse. Solder joints are very delicate, and so, you know, they're not something that you really want to subject a whole lot of, you know, stuff to. Like it's really meant to hold the wires in place and not a whole lot else. You don't want to rely on that as a structural thing, and so if you're pulling on it like that, it's eventually going to let go. So something like that happened in this guitar. The thing that makes this unique as opposed to, like, you know, most point-to-point wired guitars is that when you turn this guitar over and you look at the wiring on the inside, I'm going to go ahead and shift the camera here so that you can really get a good look. The wiring in this guitar is all done with not point-to-point. So what you're looking at in here is a printed circuit board with flexible PCB ribbons in here that are making the connections between the components and this PCB board here, which is preamp and does other stuff. It's got electronics inside it. This has IC chips and is a complex little piece to see in a guitar. So what happened is that this guy down in here is the potentiometer that we were looking at before that got to spin around, and this had a ribbon connector that was connected here but also connected down here. And so we're left with this issue where the original PCB, original flex PCB that was connecting these components was broken. And while you can, it's possible, I'm not saying it's not, you can get in there and you can fix directly those flex PCBs. You can, it's just very, very not fun. It's better in a lot of cases to just replace those leads with some kind of point-to-point repair, which is what we decided to do here. The issue comes in that when you're dealing with this PCB stuff, it's sometimes a little hard to trace out where everything goes. So one of these connectors, one of these leads in here, you could think about these little stripes of metal in there. Those are conductors. That's kind of like a wire. One of those ended up going to this switch here, and it was fairly obvious to suss out because you could see directly where it connected on that. You could see with your eyes where it connected on this potentiometer to this switch. The other one, though, connected to that potentiometer and then came all the way around and ended up being this last little guy here that plugs into this connector here. This is problematic because when you're dealing with something that's like a ribbon connector, flex PCB or anything like that that's going into just a connector on a printed circuit board, you should never really assume that you know where that's going, what's going on with it. You're always going to want to double check and always going to want to, suss that out. That's going to require having a multimeter on hand, or at the very least a continuity tester that you can use to, figure out where things go. And so in this case, what I ended up having to do was go in here and on the switch part of this flex cable that was damaged. I had to go in there and I had to kind of use a chisel to kind of peel away some of the plastic, some of this plastic insulation, so that I could get at that that wire that's inside and touch my continuity tester to it here, and then plug this in over here and kind of go through the lugs on the back and figure out where it is. Because on the back there's going to be these connectors like this here that basically are, a little kind of pointy thing that comes from a component, or this, this little guy here, and goes through the board and gets soldered to a pad in the back. And so I had to check all of those pads to figure out which one of those it went to. Fortunately, this one is pretty straightforward, but you really should never assume. A lot of times these connectors can be what's kind of referred to as a black box, which means that, like, you see something go in one end and you see something come out the other, but what happens in between you don't really have a good idea of, because it's an opaque piece of plastic and it's not really possible to look and see where everything is going in there. It could, you could be assuming that it goes to this one link and it doesn't. The problem with that is that, as opposed to things that don't contain a preamp and don't have potentially battery power and stuff flowing through them, this is a delicate component that can be fried very easily and very quickly with not much warning at all, if any. And so if you solder the wrong thing to the wrong thing, you run the risk of burning out this amp. This brings us to another point. I'm not sure if I made this early in the video, but Parkers aren't made anymore. So if you destroy this preamp in here, you're gonna have a hell of a time finding a replacement for it. So let's not do that. And again, just make sure that we're running through and making sure that we know where that connection is. Once you have that, you're going to have to actually engineer a little connector on your wire to go to those pads and those lugs in order to repair it. And what I usually like to do is I'll take the wire and I'll kind of curl it back on itself in a tiny, tiny, tiny little loop that's big enough to fit over the wire, just barely, that's going through that pad, and then fit onto that soldering pad, and then I'll use that as my my kind of connector, and then I'll solder that to that pad, and then I'll run it out to the other one. That's how I like to do it. So all that being said, let's go over maybe some preventative measures that you folks with Parkers can take. The first that I would say is using a star washer. So a star washer is, it's something that looks like this. Sometimes the little pointy bits are on the outside. It doesn't really matter, because what this thing does is it sits kind of underneath, whatever surface you're bolting the potentiometer to. So, this is under here. There could be a guitar plate here, so your pick guard, or in this case, just the top of the guitar, and then over that, goes your standard washer and goes your bolt, and then you tighten it down. But the cool thing about these star washers is as you can imagine, that thing doesn't really like rotating all that much. It's very pointy, and so it bites into the surface that you're bolting to. And so if the bolt becomes loose on the potentiometer like it did on this guitar here, this is going to mean that you might get a little bit of a rattle. You'll definitely be able to feel that it's loose, but it's not going to want to let the pot just kind of completely rotate around and do its own thing and rip a connector like this one did. Or, you know, for those of you who don't have a Parker guitar and don't have these, these flex cables inside them, you know, it won't pull solder joints out, which is also a thing that can happen. So that's kind of one of the things that I would recommend off the top of my head, is that if you own one of these guitars and you happen to be getting inside the electronics bay for any purpose whatsoever, have some star washers on hand. These are really cheap. You can get them from like Mauser. You can get them from like, I think you can just order these in bulk on eBay and Amazon. But just have a few of these on hand and, you know, just slip them under there. You might have to, sometimes these will have a spacer nut and you'll have to take that out and put the star washer on and maybe a couple other washers in lieu of that spacer nut. But have this on the bottom so that it doesn't allow the potentiometer to rotate around. That in itself would have prevented this from happening. And, you know, it's just generally a good idea. I always use these if I can. The only instances in which I will not use one of these is if I just really, really cannot possibly get it to fit in the guitar. Like if the plate is too thick to bolt to or something. Like, this is just, in my opinion, kind of an essential thing that you should definitely be trying to include in your plans for wiring up those components, because of how important this is for keeping all your wiring and stuff safe on the inside. So for those of you who were listening to my talk about all of this, I want to make something really clear here. I'm not suggesting that everybody, you know, who has one of these guitars and has this particular problem go in there and do this repair themselves. As I said, it's very easy to do this wrong, to wire the wrong thing up and to burn this thing up. Like literally you'll see smoke come off of it and then it's toast. That's it. Then you're into like real circuit board repair land, where, like, you know, the part that you burnt out hopefully has like a product number that's still being made and you can order that and you can replace it, but not all the time. So, you know, definitely take a lot of care. I would only recommend this for folks that have done, you know, had a background in doing some circuit board repair. I've got a little bit of a background in that, you know, and I would say that looking at this, when I see stuff like this, I kind of take out the set of knowledge that I learned, you know, going to college for doing like circuit board and electronics repair. That's the kind of book that opens up in my brain, not the luthier book, which tends to focus on like the point-to-point wiring stuff. This is kind of a little bit of a different skill set. It can get a lot more complex, and it's very, very delicate stuff. It's very easy to burn up these PCB boards as you're soldering them. It's very easy to like wire the wrong thing, as I said multiple times here. I'm going to keep on harping on that because, boy, that sucks when that happens. But yeah, definitely if you plan on jumping into a repair in something that looks like this, make sure you are very confident in what you are doing. Unless you can afford to lose that part, it's best not to go poking at stuff that you're not super familiar with. Just going to put that out there for you guys. As it is, you know, this repair is going to end up running a little bit more than I usually charge for doing this kind of electronics repair, just because of the nature and the delicacy of, you know, a lot of these components in here, and again, having to kind of pull from other sources of knowledge that I've worked with in the past, that other shops may or may not have had. Luthiers have all kinds of different backgrounds. Sometimes, you know, you're going to be taking something to somebody who used to do like TV repair or something, and sometimes you're going to be taking to somebody who used to do house framing. Like, it's different. We have different skill sets. There may have been a point in time in the past when I wouldn't have taken this job just because of how complex this little part is in here. And again, fortunately, this came out to be something pretty straightforward, but it's not always the case. Anyway, for you Parker guys out there, remember my recommendation about these star washers. They're super cheap and they're super easy to install, and they might prevent you from dealing with this problem. And you should keep that in mind, because there's a lot of parts in here that are no longer gettable. You can't get them anymore because Parkers aren't made anymore. So definitely want to try keeping that stuff intact if you can, and take those preventative measures. Anyway, this has been Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington. If you found this video particularly helpful and you want to kick me a few bucks on Ko-fi or in Patreon, there's links to those in the description of this video. If you have questions that you want to leave me that are more than like, 1 or 2 sentences, I definitely prefer to get those questions through Ko-fi or Patreon. I will answer them there. I will get to you real fast. As far as any other questions that are left down in the comments, I'll get to them when I get to them. I'll occasionally kind of spend a lazy afternoon going through those comments and answering people's questions, but it may take me a while. So, just keep that in mind. If you got something really pressing that you want to ask, do it through Patreon, do it through Ko-fi. I also have a description, or in the description to that video, there's also a link to my Reverb page where I sell some cool vintage instruments. There's also a link down there to my website that has my pricing info, and a link, or my pricing info, my contact info, and also a page that I wrote up on how to kind of care for your stringed instruments and everything. And if you're here watching this video, I'm going to guess that there might be 1 or 2 things in there for you too. I have lots more videos like this on my channel, varying from simple restring tutor videos to kind of complex things, or talking about vintage guitars and things like that. So if that seems like your bag, go check out my other videos, link them to friends. Otherwise, again, this has been Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington. Thank you for watching.